All right, so the reading for today, Moti Mizrahi. It's a pretty cool name, I think. He's written a lot about questions of expertise and authority, even as a paper I was considering using, Respect My Authority. That's the subtitle of one of his papers. It was almost good enough to squeak it into the class, but this one actually addresses more of the material that I wanted to cover, I felt that we should be covering. It's a totally different direction than the last paper. Totally different than what Tom Nichols was doing. So last time we talked about what an expert is, how does one achieve expertise, and what is problematic when you ignore the experts. Mizrahi is countering, we'll see, in a subtle way. It doesn't seem very subtle at first, but the question I asked at the beginning here, what if ignoring experts is not always that bad? When you first read this, and if you hadn't, I'll go over it, of course, but it is a bit longer, and I didn't know where to cut without ruining, getting the thread of it gone. And it's an excellent paper as a kind of model for how to do philosophy papers. It's a longer version of what you do in this class. So if you haven't read it yet, do so. It even uses standard logical form on page 58, the second page, where he's putting forth his argument. And then he spends the next 16 or so pages expanding on, in particular, premise 2, as we'll see, the empirical claim, the argument that appealing to expertise is not good. It's weak, right? And then, what does he do? He gives counter-arguments, rebuttals. He comes up with a lot of them. And notice the counter-arguments he comes up with are not straw man fallacies. He's not straw manning the counters. He's not saying, look at what these idiots think, and then attacking that misrepresentation. He's coming up with strong arguments against his position, and then addressing each one in turn. He comes up with like 9 of them. I think that's a good model for how to write philosophically. You may not agree with this conclusion, that's fine. But think of it in terms of a model of how well to write philosophy. Okay. Now, having said that, what was your first impression of his conclusion? Well, of the title. What is the title? Why arguments from expert opinion are weak. This seems to be the opposite of what Tom Nichols said. When you first read this, when you first looked at the title, it's like, wait a minute, what does weak mean? First of all, he tells us this multiple times. You know what all these words mean. What is a weak argument in logic? It's a specific kind of argument that it's referring to that are called weak. Who wants to offer that? A weak argument is... Go back to induction, deduction?
Induction.
Yeah. Say again?
It's an inductive argument. Since we attribute soundness and soundness to deductive, and then weakness/strongness to induction.
That's right. Inductive arguments are either strong or weak. And then, once you've established that they are strong or weak, you then ask the next question, are they cogent or uncogent? A strong argument, and strength applies to induction, or the term that Mizrahi uses here, defeasible arguments. A defeasible argument is one in which it's possible to have all true premises and yet still a false conclusion. Now, that's true of deduction as well. It's just that would be an invalid deductive argument. Arguments arguments from authority, from expert opinion, are inductive because, as he admits, and so do all of those who he quotes, it's always possible to have true premises and a false conclusion. That possibility just means it's defeasible, which is to say it just means it's inductive, which just means it's possible that the conclusion is false even though everything in it is true. We don't evaluate inductive arguments by way of deduction. And he's making it very clear that's not what he's doing. When he says arguments by now, why do I keep saying that? Arguments from expert opinion are weak. He's not saying they're bad because they're inductive. He's very clear about that. He's saying they are weak because there is no good reason to say proposition P, whatever it is true or likely to be true simply because expert E says it. That is the arguing from authority. And to show you that he's not setting up a straw man fallacy where, look at what these people say, I'm going to attack that. He quotes heavily from very popular logic textbooks, one, in fact, that I've used many years ago. Introduction to Logic, 10th edition. How could it be 10th edition? Well, that's one of the reasons, by the way, I don't use textbooks anymore. It was a logic textbook. It wasn't this one. It was a Hurley textbook in which, and by the way, Hurley, he didn't include here, he also defines argument by authority in a way that's always non-fallacious, assuming the authority is an expert in that particular area that they're concluding about. I'll talk about that more in a moment. But that textbook got to its 14th edition, hardback, color, almost $200. Why 14 editions? Every 2 years they changed editions. It got me wondering, is logic fundamentally changing every 2 years? It is not. So why would they change editions? My jaded interpretation was to make more money. And that pissed me off. And so I don't use textbooks anymore. It's a little bit harder to get the readings that you want. In some cases, it's easier and better. So anyway, this is the 10th edition from Introduction to Logic. Quote, when we argue that a given conclusion is correct on the ground that an expert authority has come to that judgment, we commit no fallacy. I think it should be clear. If they had said, when we argue that a given conclusion is correct only on the ground that an expert authority has come to that judgment, we commit no fallacy. That would be problematic. And I think that's what Mizrahi is attacking. The only that part. This is page 57. It's the very first page of the reading. And we want to know, how did they come to that conclusion? If I say this claim is true because Mizrahi says it, and Mizrahi is an expert in logic, philosophy of science, philosophy of questions about authority, expertise, testimony, and so forth, many of the things he's written about. If you click on that link, it'll show you more of his writing, Florida Institute of Technology at the Philosophy Department. And he's written a lot about this issue and countered. He's been able to publish a lot on this particular issue because he gets to rebut those detractors. It's a fantastic setup. If you write a good paper that's controversial, you can get other people to write about that paper, and then you can respond to your critics, and then you've got publishing opportunities so you don't perish. Remember the publish or perish nonsense. In any case, this is what logicians have presumed. If someone's an expert in the relevant area, their expertise plays a role in making that claim more likely true than not. To continue that quote, it's not a fallacy to say this is true because the expert said it. And that expert is relevant. Their expertise is relevant to this field. To continue with that quote from Copy, indeed, such recourse to authority is necessary for most of us on very many matters. That's right. I told you that last time. I'm not an expert in politics. I'm not an expert in economics, in tax policy. I've got to appeal to those who I take to be experts. I don't have time to become well-versed or sufficiently versed in these particular areas to be able to come up with conclusions, to go back to Tom Nichols, that might go against what the experts think. I just don't have that time, so I rely on others. And that's what this common sense notion of expertise is saying. And now, again, the quote goes on. Of course, could have been straight out of Tom Nichols' reading from last time. Of course, an expert's judgment constitutes no conclusive proof. What does that mean? It's not deductive. No argument from expertise is deductive. It's inductive. It's defeasible. It's possible the conclusion is false. Experts disagree. Even in agreement, they may err. They may make mistakes. But expert opinion surely is one reasonable way to support a conclusion. That's the key. Expert opinion is a reasonable way to support a conclusion. He gives another quote from the Essentials of Logic from 2007. Quote, you believe most of what your professors say. Cautious here. When they're speaking within their areas of training and research, it is reasonable to do so. They are authorities in their fields. And remember the distinction of authority. It has two senses. Position of power, an authority figure, and someone who has what Mizrahi refers to as epistemic authority. Expertise with respect to knowledge. So I just prefer, that's why he uses expertise as opposed to the ambiguous term authority. Although, again, he did write a paper subtitled, "You Shall Respect My Authority." He's a South Park fan. Good for him. So they are authorities in their fields. This doesn't mean that they're always right. Everyone occasionally makes mistakes. But there is good reason to believe that they are right. And here's from Nichols, same thing. They are right the overwhelming majority of the time. And that's what Nichols says. And that's the common sense view. Of course these people know more about this field than me. I don't know anything about it. I haven't spent one thousandth, is that how I'm saying it right? Of the time that they have in this particular field, their knowledge is vaster than mine. Mizrahi is not discounting that. What he's saying, well, let's look at what he's saying. He's not saying this. Premise 1, most experts on subject matter S, whatever it is, agree that P. Most experts on global climate change agree that climate change is happening, or climate change is caused by human activities. Therefore, P. Therefore, climate change is happening, and so forth. This is not what he's arguing for, or against, excuse me. He's not arguing against this. And it's a subtle but very important distinction. As he points out, this is page 61 of the reading, this is arguing from agreement among experts, not expertise as such. I think I need to expand on that quote. I cut too much of it. I'm not concerned with arguments from authority of this sort, because I think he doesn't see those as problematic. He doesn't see that as a weak argument. So that's not his concern here. Page 61, just beneath where I was quoting there. Rather, I'm concerned with arguments that cite the mere fact that an expert says that P, and here you have a dash where it gets along convoluted, as opposed to the fact that P is common knowledge in a particular field, or that the expert in question is reporting what most experts in the field say that P, as the only reason to accept it. Now that's very confusing. In other words, he's not saying this is a problem. If it is the case, it's commonly accepted that most experts in this field say this. Therefore, this is likely true. That's not what he's refuting. That's not what he sees as a weak argument. What he sees as a weak argument is where one says, expert E says that P. Expert E is an expert in this area. Therefore, P, that proposition, that conclusion, is true. That is what he's arguing against. And that is what he thinks is represented in the first opening quotes that I just referenced to you in those logic textbooks. So he is taking a rather controversial position in contrast to other logicians with respect to the question of authority, with respect to the question of expertise. Here's his argument. Here's the standard logical form, so we get a really clear sense of the reasoning involved. Premise 1. Arguments from expert opinion are weak arguments unless the fact that expert E says that P makes it significantly more likely that P is true. Climate scientist says P is true. The fact that they're a climate scientist, does the origin of this, the source of this claim, make it more or less likely? He's going to give evidence against this notion. Premise 2. As empirical evidence on expertise shows, the fact that E says that P does not make it significantly more likely that P is true. He's, in other words, denying this consequent. If you deny the consequent, you end up then denying the antecedent. He's using a logical deductive argument here to show arguments from expertise are weak. What is this, by the way, if he just leaves it at this? As empirical evidence on expertise shows, he just left that in the whole paper and never said what the empirical evidence was. What's that called? Proof surrogate, precisely. He probably could have said something here in the standard logical form portion. And by the way, I'm going to get to that evidence in a moment. He doesn't, but it comes very quickly. So it's not a proof surrogate technically, because he does address the bulk of the paper on premise 2. But it just isn't the case. The fact that he says that makes it more likely true. It's just false, he says. So, arguments from expert opinion are weak arguments. Go ahead.
How do you add like empirical evidence to a masculine argument where you say it as it is true, but how do you prove that it is true when you're stating the evidence?
Well, so if we were looking at this and we wanted to expand on this argument, we would then add another premise. And premise 2 is supported by a study by Tetlock, 2005. Here was the conclusion. Here's what makes that conclusion true. If you wanted to expand on this in the standard logical form, at least reference what the study was and why that study shows what you think is the case, why premise 2 is in fact the case.
And then it's up to the reader to like check that if that's
Not-
a study? Or?
Not necessarily, no. It's up to you to reference the study, but also if it's central to your paper, central to your conclusion, in your paper, and he does this too, in the essay section of his paper, he says, here's the data, and he importantly points this out. Don't accept my conclusion about expertise because I'm an expert. I'm not doing that. I'm not saying accept my conclusion that expert opinions aren't sufficient to justify a claim because I'm an expert saying that. No. I'm looking at empirical data that shows this. And I didn't even do the research. Luckily, other people did the research. Here's what they did. But he doesn't engage in a proof surrogate because he cites the sources and then gives his own words and arguments as to why the conclusions that they arrived at support the conclusion he's offering. So if it's central to your paper, then you can't just quote something and say, this study showed this at this time, and here's a citation, here's where you can look it up. That's a kind of misplacing the burden. If we do that with respect to a central claim in your argument. If it's a peripheral claim that may make additional cumulative support for your position, but it's not central to your argument, you can put that in a footnote, for instance. You can cite it and show this is further evidence for what I'm saying, but you don't need to then go in to expand on it. But in this case, premise 2, this needs support. Simply citing a study that gave you the conclusion you wanted isn't enough. He needs to show, and maybe this is debatable whether he succeeds in this. Does he not only cite the sources that prove premise 2, that there's empirical research that shows being an expert is insufficient by itself to make a claim more likely true than not? And then does he expand on that and give reasons for why it supports his view? Let's see if he does. So here's part of the argument, and then I'll get to the empirical claim. Does that, first of all, that make a little more sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So with respect to premise 1, why would it ever be the case that a claim is granted more reliability just because of who the source is? Do you remember this example I gave about the death penalty? And we had Sister Helen Prejean present an argument, and then we had, who was the other guy? Got a swastika on his face? Charles Manson, right? And the question was, which argument is better? And I don't remember what everyone said, but intuitively, if you look at Sister Helen Prejean, no swastikas that I know of anywhere, makes that argument. And let's also know she's an expert. Let's imagine she is. She did write a lot about the death penalty, and she has written a lot about, she's part of the Innocence Project, so she knows a lot about it. She knows more about it probably than Charles Manson. But notice what we said then. It would be an ad hominem fallacy to say Manson's argument is weaker than Sister Helen Prejean's. Why would that be? First of all, it was word for word identical, their arguments. And so to say that his argument is worse than hers is just weird, because logically they are identical. We ought to be able to evaluate the claims and the reasoning from the claims based upon the arguments themselves, not the purveyor of the argument, not the source of the argument. The source of the argument ought not matter. Even when it comes to experts versus non-experts? Mizrahi says, yes, even then. If your conclusion is This claim is true because it comes from this expert. That is a weak argument always. And he's claiming that has been the definition of a non-fallacious appeal to authority. Now, if you go back to Copey, you go back to Hurley, you go back to other logic textbooks, they do distinguish. This is an acceptable inductive inference to appeal to this qualified authority in this particular field. If this person's a qualified authority in that field, that fact that they're experts gives greater credence to their claim than if they weren't. That's not a fallacy, as Copey puts it. But if you say this person's an expert in field A, but is concluding about something in field B, that would be the fallacious appeal to unqualified authority. That's been the traditional conception of appeal to authority, fallacious versus non-fallacious. Mizrahi is saying, nope, even the one in which they claim to be or are experts in that field, that is insufficient to say you have a strong argument. They are inherently weak. They are what we might call a positive ad hominem. Do you remember the distinction of a positive and negative ad hominem? I say this argument is no good because this person's no good. That's a negative ad hominem. That's to the person. I say this argument is good because it's from Aristotle. I love Aristotle, therefore I love this conclusion. I conclude that women are inferior to men. Why? Why is that true? Aristotle said it, and I like Aristotle, therefore true. That is a weak argument. And I think that's what Mizrahi's trying to say, to try to be charitable to his position, especially in contrast to Nichols' very aggressive argument against those who've led to this death of expertise that we're living through, as he puts it. Go ahead.
How can he cite sources then if he doesn't believe that?
That's great.
Trust?
Right. You look at the text. Let's see. Who are all these people he's citing? He's got a lot of them. There's a lot of sources. And a lot of these textbooks, these authors I recognize from logic textbooks. There's Daniel Kahneman in there. He quotes himself twice. Whoops. What'd you do there, man? Well, he addresses this in one of the multitude of rebuttals and replies. He replies to it and says, look, do not accept my arguments here simply because I'm an authority. And he doesn't discount the fact that experts in a particular field are going to have greater access to information. Go back to our understanding of what an expert is from the Nichols article and from the lecture last time. He wouldn't discount any of those criteria of an expert. And again, even though it's a bit vague and muddy in certain situations, he wouldn't discount any of that. What he discounts is saying, simply because of who I am, the conclusion I derive is granted greater acceptability or is more reliable just because of who it came from. And that's why I rephrased it as a fallacy, a positive ad hominem. It's saying, I like this person, therefore their conclusions are good. This person's an expert, therefore their conclusion follows. He thinks no. And he wouldn't say that's what he's doing. And he wouldn't say that citing sources here is a problem. It would be citing sources without saying why those particular sources are doing what you want them to do. Does that clarify a bit? Let me expand on this. Premise 2. He gives the example of electrochemists Fleischmann and Pons, who concluded at one point that nuclear fusion can occur at room temperature. Now, that would have been amazing. This is in the late 80s. If that study could have been replicated and shown to be accurate, that would have changed the world. We would not be in the energy crisis. We would not have problems that we do now with climate science and so forth if that were true. Because it would have been a means of creating energy without losing energy, without using any. That's an extraordinary conclusion. What kind of evidence does one need to support an extraordinary claim? Extraordinary. It turns out this study could not be replicated. And so the traditional conception of appeal to expertise would have been, look, they're experts in this particular field. They conclude this, therefore this is true. Straightforward. That's a non-fallacious appeal to authority, according to the textbooks that he cited at the beginning of this reading. But as it turns out, they couldn't replicate this. Surprise, nuclear fusion cannot happen at room temperature that we know of. Maybe it's possible, but certainly not at the moment. We would all know it. Go ahead.
I was just thinking about how, like, we are, like, how are we someone to disprove an expert's theory?
Very good. It isn't that we are disproving it. So, let's imagine I say to you, Dr. Fauci, the Fauci, close. Tony, let's call him. Hey, Tony says vaccines work. Therefore, vaccines work. Is that satisfying to you? Should it be satisfying to you?
Well, isn't that circular? Just a circular argument?
Well, how so?
Because it's not necessary. Like saying you're saying the same thing in your premises and your conclusion.
Am I?
Or,
Dr. Fauci says vaccines work. Therefore, vaccines work. That's not circular.
oh well, if it's just solely based on him, then I
It-
see why there's the fallacy.
Exactly. And yet, he argues, it always comes to that. Even when you try to make it less obviously fallacious, as he puts it. When I say, on page 60, expert says, it is better to invest in real estate than in bonds. Non-expert. Why? Expert. Because I say so. That's why. What? Who would ever accept that? I mean, we don't. Go back to the Euthyphro dilemma. Do you remember the Euthyphro dilemma with Socrates? Euthyphro, the expert, self-proclaimed expert, in all things pious, let's say holy, virtuous. Socrates asks him, what is piety, expert? And Euthyphro says, I know what it is. Of course I know what it is. I'm an expert in this, basically. What I say is true because I'm an expert. That's the kind of weak argument Mizrahi's arguing against. And Socrates addressed early on. And if you recall, Euthyphro eventually says, piety, holiness, goodness is whatever the gods command. Whatever they like. No, wait a minute, Socrates asks. Is it right because they command it? Or do they command it because it is right? There's a big difference. And remember my example of having to wear a uniform in high school? Or I get in trouble for not wearing the uniform? No, I didn't tell you that? It's relevant, so I'll do it real quick. In Houston, anyone been to Houston? It's a horrible city. Too humid all the time. Except now, this is my favorite time of year in Houston because the air finally gets crisp for a couple of weeks. So I love, maybe that's why I like Halloween so much, because I grew up in Houston. And this is when it finally gets cool. But I had to wear a uniform. We all did it in high school. And the uniform was comprised of, I think it was a long sleeve shirt most of the time, but corduroy pants. Do you know what corduroy pants are? Do they make them? They're very thick, not good for humid, hot weather. And I didn't want to wear a uniform. I didn't want to wear a belt. Didn't want to do any of that crap. And I would get penance halls, which means punishment, detention. You come to school after class and you sit there with your hands on the desk doing nothing for 30 minutes, which was a stupid punishment. I learned nothing but to be angry at the system. And I'd always ask, but why do I have to wear a uniform? And guess what their shitty response was? Because those are the rules, which is another version of we say so. Oh, really? Because you're I didn't say this. Because you're an authority? That's arbitrary and capricious. I didn't say that. I wish I had. Instead, I just went, whatever. And I got more detentions. But I learned after the fact that there is a reason. They had a reason. But they just didn't tell me. Or maybe the person who gave me the punishments didn't tell me. Does anyone have a good justification for why high schools might require uniforms?
It's not justification, it's just what my school said was that it puts everyone on like the same playing field in terms of like nobody wears something that's like nicer than someone else, so it's like that's what
That is a justification, and it's a damn good one, now that I think about it. Now, if they told me that at the time, this is why you're being punished, because you broke the rules. But why are those the rules? Well, because I, as an authority figure, say they're the rules. But why is that the case? What are you making the rule, and therefore everyone follows it because of you? Or do you, rule maker, have a reason for that particular rule? Oh, it turns out we do have reasons for the rule. you need to respect my authority, but also understand I have reasons for I have expertise, if you want. We have uniforms so that the rich kids don't make fun of the poor kids, to put it in oversimplified terms. Do high school kids make fun of others for their outfits? Can you make fun of somebody for their outfit when you're wearing the same damn outfit? I guess you can, but it doesn't really work. It backfires. So that's a decent justification for wearing a uniform. And if they had just told me, I don't know if I would have accepted it, but I suspect I would have said, well, that makes sense. Right? I get that. I understand why we need to wear a uniform. Why do we have to wear a belt, though? I could have gone on with it. But there you see, it is not authority itself that makes the claim true or false, or increases the likelihood of it being true or false. It's the reasons that the authority figures have. Now, to go back to Nichols, would experts in a particular domain of study have greater access to reasons to justify their claims? I think yes, Mizrahi would agree with that. But that's not the kind of argument he's refuting. He's showing we do not get to conclusions that are more likely true simply because and only because they come from putative experts. He gives other examples. Philip Tetlock, in 2005, found that the experts were only slightly more accurate than chance, around 55%. More than chance, but statistically not that relevant. And it's interesting who the experts were and what their field was. I think that's significant here. I don't think Mizrahi focuses enough on that distinction. But Tetlock found that experts were only slightly more accurate than chance and much less accurate than decision procedures. To say that experts were only slightly more than accurate than chance is to say that they might as well have been guessing, end quote. What's a decision procedure? He has a whole paper devoted to this in a different subject. But does anyone know what a decision procedure is? He might give a little bit. He should have done more, I think, because he does see that as a legitimate, like a note 8. And he references other people. Note 8, page 64. A decision procedure is a step-by-step process that terminates with a decision or judgment, for example, yes, no, true, false, 1, 0, or 1, etc. And then he gives an example of simple procedure for evaluating natural language arguments. Decision procedures are oftentimes used with deductive proofs. They're used with geometric proofs, where you follow a particular path, a particular procedure, a particular list. Doctors will do this. Interestingly, Malcolm Gladwell references how to avoid mistakes. Even if I'm an expert airline pilot, what do pilots do? They've got a checklist, a decision procedure that they follow. When doctors engage in this procedure, fewer mistakes happen. Then we back it up a bit and say, who came up with the list? Were those experts? Doesn't matter. It matters how the list, how the decision procedure, how the decision tree, the flow chart, what have you, was constructed and whether it works. It doesn't matter who did it. It matters how well it works. In fact, he quotes Tetlock going further. Most of the experts that he studied did no better than a dart-throwing chimpanzee. And I had to find an image of that. Guess what? It wasn't hard. There it is. Now, that's a terrible analogy. I think that's photoshopped in there. He's not holding a dart. Come on. In any case, that's not a very good analogy. Or if it is, how is one establishing that a dart-throwing chimpanzee is going to get better than chance? They're not going to get the dartboard at all. It's ridiculous.
I have like a good analogy. In my other class, they were talking about like criminal profiling, and they did studies on.
Sorry, what?
In one of my other class, they did a study on criminal profiling.
Uh-huh.
And they said they were trying to find out who does better at it. And one of the groups was like experts and like detectives and whatever. And the other one was college chemistry students. And it turns out the college chemistry students who knew nothing about it did way better.
What?
And accurate.
Oh, no.
So I thought that was relatable.
That is frightening. So let's recap that. What was the class?
The class,
What's the class called?
crime, human behavior.
What is it?
Crime and human behavior.
Crime and human behavior. And in that class, they discovered that, or there's a study they showed that veteran detectives did worse than novice detectives with psychological profiling?
Criminal profiling.
Criminal profile.
Accuracy was off.
Well, what is criminal profiling? Is that where you look at someone's psychological profile to see whether they're prone to crime?
It's like, if you look at a crime scene, like the things in it,
Uh-huh.
how that might lead to a person's characteristics.
Oh, I see.
So they guessed a person's characteristics for after.
Oh, I see. Given the data in front of you, here's the crime scene. Now let's try to figure out something about the psychology of the person who did this. And novices, what were they, chemistry students?
Yeah, they were like the control group was like chemistry students.
And they did better than long-term actual veteran detectives.
Yeah.
And what's the explanation for that?
I don't know.
Oh, they didn't give one.
Well, they like theorized about it. That
What's a theory? Because that's right up the alley here. This is perfectly connected.
Maybe that since they've been in it for so long, they're
Mhm.
blinded by certain different aspects of it, rather than
Uh-huh.
just looking at the concrete facts.
Well, that's the double-edged sword of expertise and experience over time. If I'm an expert technician in my field, remember the example I gave of my electrical problem at the house, right? I couldn't figure it out. I looked all over the place. So clearly I wasn't better than the expert. The guy walks in within 5 seconds. There it is. I felt so bad. But if he couldn't find it, if it were other people who were trying to find the problem, and he said, no, this is it, I'm certain. Think of it in terms of airline pilots who don't listen to their co-pilot. Airline pilots have been doing it for years and years and years, have thousands and thousands of hours in the cockpit. This is an example from Malcolm Gladwell. I can't remember if it's Outliers or Blink, or as he references it in both. But why were certain airlines so prone to accidents? It is Korean Air, South Korean Air, I think it was one of the examples. Or I don't know if it was South Korean Air, it was Korean Air. And one of the hypotheses was the pilot, the expert, with many, many, many more hours flying than the co-pilot, refused to listen to advice from the co-pilot. Instead was stuck, and I think this is on par with what you're saying. Yes, they're experts, but if that's all they're relying upon, they're not relying upon anything external to that. Decision procedures, decision trees, flowcharts, other people's claims, other people's advice, in this case, the co-pilot. And because in the Korean, this is one of the hypotheses, in Korea there's a hierarchy where those with greater social value or greater expertise, let's put it in this context, don't listen to those with less. And as a result, more accidents. And the consequences were deadly. If only they had listened in a number of cases, or if they followed a simple checklist, instead of relying upon their presumed expertise, lots of mistakes would have been avoided. In addition, we can imagine, the older you get, the more prone you are to be rigid in your assumptions about the world, especially if you've been doing something for so long that has maybe worked for you. This has always worked for me. Experts fall prey to confirmation bias. Experts fall prey to fallacy. Of course I'm going to keep doing it this way. Now, why a chemistry student would do better is mind-boggling. Now, who are the criminals? What's the age span of the criminals in the study? Do we know that? Oh,
It was like already, crimes already happened, so
Yep.
they could like fact check it.
that's right. That's what they'd have to do for us to be able to know what the answers are. So we would know the age of the criminals. Maybe the chemistry students are of proportionate age to the criminals and therefore can more readily, I don't know. It's fascinating to me. But that's a hypothesis. It's not that they're experts in forensic science. It's just that, the criminals are of their age group, and therefore there may be peers, and they're more likely to get into their mindset than, say, an older, even veteran detective. I don't know. That's scary, though. And maybe when you were reading through some of this, you realized, holy shit, this is scary. Some of these people are claiming to be experts, but wait a minute. Page 64. Friedman, 2010, compiles. There's a misprint, by the way. He says complies the results. It's compiles. I found an error. This paper's trash. Throw it out. I'm sorry. Compiles the results of several studies on expertise, which include the following. Approximately 2/3 of the findings published in top medical journals are rejected after a few years. There is a 1 in 12 chance that a physician's diagnosis will be wrong to the extent that it could cause significant harm to the patient, Most studies published in economics journals are rejected after a few years. That is, the results of the studies are subsequently considered to be incorrect. And tax returns prepared by professionals are more likely to contain errors than tax returns prepared by non-professionals? What? Why is this happening? Other researchers have conducted studies that confirm the aforementioned results. And he gives a lot of other information. Some of the details he focuses on, others he expands upon. What he should expand upon, though, is the difference, and there's a link to this textbook. Everything is obvious once you know the answer. This is on political expertise. And as Aristotle told us long ago, standards of credibility, standards of truth are different in different disciplines. The standard of what is a true conclusion in mathematics is going to be different than that in engineering. And what is true or what constitutes truth in engineering is going to be different than that what constitutes truth in biology. And what's true in biology and what constitutes justification for a claim is going to be different than what is deemed true or standard of justification in ethics or politics especially. And so that is one of the reasons why it matters. What's the field of study we're talking about? Mizrahi doesn't focus on this. What is a political expert? And why do political experts get things wrong so often? Because they're not dealing with purely abstract, numerical, quantifiable entities. Political scientists, sociologists, psychologists are dealing with human beings, the most complex entities in the known universe. So the criteria, the standard, what qualifies an expert in that field is probably going to be different than what qualifies as an expert in a different field like theoretical physics or mathematics that may not have specifically anything to do with human beings. In any case, what does this mean? Again, review page 64, page 65. It seems disheartening. Why go to the doctor? You think you might have a tumor? You might as well go to your next door neighbor who's a plumber. What's the difference? If experts are no better than non-experts, what's the point of it all? Does this not inevitably lead down the slippery slope to extreme skepticism? What's extreme skepticism? Anyone? Extreme skepticism?
Relativism?
No, relativism is to say a claim is true relative to a culture. So they would say there are truths. It's just that there's no way of establishing one truth is better than another. They're culturally dependent. Skeptic is saying something, go ahead. Although they could collapse into each other, actually. I might have said that before, so it's not necessarily wrong. What's that?
That we can't really know anything.
That we can't know anything, that knowledge is impossible. Some of you are going to be writing about this in your papers. That knowledge. Did you want to add to it?
Oh, yeah, and in that case, you're making a knowledge claim.
You have,
That's
it's,
so-
if it's extreme skepticism, right? And be cautious. I think in the paper I have you focus on that, or I talk about that, relativism. And one of the things you want to look at is avoiding a straw man and say, I'm only going to address extreme skepticism and show that that's flawed. Be careful that you're not addressing a straw man. Remember, he's pointing out where people do say this. They do say that this is the definition of a non-fallacious appeal to authority. And he's saying, nope, you're wrong. Those are weak arguments. If you're going to attack extreme skepticism, make sure you're attacking a position that somebody actually takes. And there's degrees to skepticism. It's kind of hard to find out where, and that's why I was pushing for that virtuous middle ground of conservatism and revisability with respect to our beliefs. Okay, so doesn't it lead to a slippery slope? Now, a slippery slope, like the conventional understanding of appeal to authority, there's a positive and negative to it. There's a fallacious and a non-fallacious slippery slope. The fallacious slippery slope is where, does anyone know what the fallacy is? Yep.
It just leads to Armageddon.
Armageddon. It's very often. Yeah, anytime somebody has as their conclusion, don't do this because it leads to Armageddon. It's almost inevitable that that's a slippery slope fallacy and not an actual slippery slope that's legitimate. The example we gave with a non-fallacious appeal to authority is to say this person's an expert here therefore it's acceptable to appeal to them. That's not a problem. The fallacious appeal to authority is to say, this person is an expert in A, but is concluding about B, therefore B is true. Wait a minute. That is a fallacious appeal to unqualified authority. Remember, that's not all Mizrahi's talking about. He's attacking appeals to qualified authority as well, assuming that appeal is all that we're using as justification for our claim. So, does it lead to a slippery slope? The fallacious notion of a slippery slope is also known as the domino fallacy, and I talked about this briefly when we discussed causal fallacies, false cause fallacies. And a slippery slope is sometimes included under that heading, because it's presuming that if we allow this domino to fall, then the next thing you know, and that's a hint that it's the fallacies afoot, when somebody says, the next thing you know, or what's next? Armageddon. That's a sense that it's extreme, obviously absolutist, exaggerated behavior. And so it's the domino fallacy because we say, don't let this first domino fall because it'll lead to this domino falling, and this domino falling would be terrible. It's only a fallacy if we fail to give the causal connections, the links between this domino and this domino. And it may be that if this falls, then this one falls, which means they're actually closely linked. But it's a fallacy if we don't make the case, if we don't make the causal connection. If the experts cannot be trusted, then what's next? Throw out all claims to knowledge? That's the nuclear option, isn't it? And that's what Nichols was arguing against. His fear was the death of expertise led to sources of knowledge being undermined. And when sources of knowledge are undermined, we no longer have a democracy. Because democracies depend upon an educated populace. If the sources of information, of knowledge, of truths about reality are poisoned, that well has been poisoned, then the demos, the populace, have no means of establishing what is true from what is false. And then their vote, their decision-making processes have been undermined. Their autonomy has been stripped from them. It is not just a purely logical, philosophical, epistemological issue, this question of propaganda, this question of disinformation, misinformation, death of expertise. It is an ethical, political, social. It is an enormous problem. As the syllabus says, it's a question of irrationality that leads to many of the issues that we have today. And isn't this what Mizrahi's arguing toward? Doesn't his conclusion lead us to this terrible path, that all claims to knowledge must be dismissed? Isn't it a slippery slope? First of all, let me make a quick tangent and explain slippery slope with an example. Imagine someone says the following, which somebody did, and I never wrote down the source when I heard this a couple of years ago now. So if somebody can find the origin of this argument, which somebody actually said, I quickly wrote it down. I think I had to pull over because I heard it on the radio, and I responsibly pulled over. I didn't just try to text it to myself while I was driving. But I didn't get who it was. But here's the argument. If we allow gay marriages, next there will be some who want group marriages. And soon, no one will even bother to get married. Shortly after that, I heard, what? We allow gay marriages? What's next? People marrying their toaster? That was another argument from a politician, which I thought, wow, that's a bad argument. We can't allow people to marry their toaster. But, by the way, people do that. They fall in love with objects. That's called objectophilia. That's a real thing. I just don't think it is anything connected here. Or at least no attempt is given. And here's how we can expand on this to show where the problems are. Because on the face of it, I don't know about that. But when you do this, put it into standard logical form, and make explicit what was merely implied, it's pretty clear what you'd have to add to the argument to realize, oh, that's just not true. That's unsupported. Premise one, since allowing gay and lesbian marriages will lead to group marriage, what? Where is that causal connection? Is it true that if you allow gay marriages, then there will be group marriages? Maybe. I don't know. No argument was given. No reason, no justification. And the person interviewing this other person didn't follow up with, where is the causal connection there? I thought that was fascinating. It's implicitly stating that there is a causal relationship between those two things. Is there? Maybe. It's not given. Premise 2. And group marriages will lead to no marriage at all. Why? Because, again, implicitly, it's not explicitly stated, there's a causal relationship between group marriage and the abandonment of marriage. And implied also is that no marriage is a bad idea, I guess. That's an easier one to assume, perhaps. Therefore, we should not allow gay or lesbian marriages. Do you see how that works? Why is this a fallacy? If we allow gay marriages, which is another way of saying, if we allow more people to get married, then fewer people will get married. That's what that actually said. And once you put it into standard logical form, you can see that's not a good argument. Something's missing. It goes the other direction too. If we don't allow same-sex marriage, then what's next? Prohibiting a Catholic from marrying a Protestant? Prohibiting a philosopher from marrying a non-philosopher? Armageddon. Again, I don't know any instance in which this term has ever been used in such a way that it wasn't fallacious, wasn't exaggerated. I don't know of any. Even the global climate change, I don't know that Armageddon is the right word for that, because that means the end of the world. Okay? So be cautious in using that term. I have a question mark here because I don't know if this is a slippery slope in a fallacious way, or is it, look, if this thing happens, yeah, these are the dominoes that are going to fall, and yeah, you're going to end up in an alley somewhere. I know you've been shooting up or with heroin. Is heroin you shoot up, I assume? Or is it the spoon? So email me if you know the answer. I'm just kidding. I know what it is. First you shoot up, then you become addicted, then you lose your job, then you rob your best friend to feed the habit, and then you end up strung out in an alley somewhere. This reminds me of one of those commercials that uses the fallacy, slippery slope, in a humorous way. Again, back to that motif of errors in reasoning can be amusing, and we get rewarded for recognizing the mistake. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Commercial where you end up getting an eye patch for some reason. Do you know what it is?
Are you talking about those cigarette commercials where the kids like peel off part of their like skin or teeth?
No, not that one. Not that one. Although that may be an example of this, I'm not familiar with that. I'm thinking of the one where the guy gets the wrong cable or the wrong dish for TV, and he learns karate on his own or something, and he gets his eye hurt, and then he's got to wear an eye patch. And if you wear an eye patch, people are going to think you're tough. And if people think you're tough, some people are going to want to see how tough you are. And then they show him running away, getting beat up. So, don't buy our competitor's product. I can't remember even what it was. So it actually wasn't a very successful commercial because I don't know what the hell they were selling. But I remember it was a slippery slope. But this isn't fallacious. I don't think, because heroin is quite addictive. And I don't think you can be a function. Maybe you can. You'd have to look into it. So this is simply a question. Certain instances of slippery slopes are not necessarily fallacious. We don't need to necessarily give all the steps to show, look, if you shoot up with heroin, you can get addicted right away. Is there evidence for that? Yeah, I think there is. Not necessarily. Maybe you won't. Maybe it'll take 2 or 3 times. I don't know. Let's move on. But it's not clear that that one's a slippery slope. So now, this leads us back to this. Questioning expertise is not the same thing as poisoning the science well. I do not think, to be charitable to Mizrahi, I don't think he's saying, in fact he's not, but one could see how this interpretation could come about, that expertise is dead. And one of the sources of expertise that he focuses upon is science. And there's a link to this. It's a book review, if you don't want to read the whole text here, from Stuart Ritchie, Science Fictions, How Fraud, Bias, Negligence, and Hype Undermine the Search for Truth. He's referencing skepticism about science. In fact, the term scientism is used. I don't think I've used that yet. Does anyone know what scientism is? Anyone heard that word? Yeah?
I mean, I had a brief, interaction with it because I saw this one video of, flat earthers talking about scientism and how I think it's just mainly relying on science, is it not?
Well, yes, but to an extraordinary extent. And so it's interesting that I'll take you were doing some research on flat earthers for edification. No, that's fine. And now you're no longer willing to travel because fall off. So, sorry, that's dismissive, my fault. But yes, it could be used, and it's wielded from all sides, right? So a flat earther will say, look, you are relying on science, but really you're relying on scientism. It's a term I think was coined by William James, turn of the late 1800s. The idea that science, which is amazing, science gives us cures for diseases, vaccines, science and technology developed together with medical procedures, capacity to get us to the moon, to get William Shatner in space, to check and see if the Earth is flat. He checked and saw that it wasn't flat. That threw me off. Why did I mention William Shatner? I was going along. What was I trying to do? Oh, scientism, yes. And so science is amazing. And if you start looking back in the history of science, and there ought to be more history of science classes for scientists, because scientists oftentimes forget that there's more to the story than the success. How many times did Edison fail in trying to develop the light bulb? I don't know. There's a lot. It wasn't, hey, light bulb, boom, done. But that's typically how we see things. We got our iPhone. This is awesome. This phone is amazing. It took a long time. Mostly failures. That's what science is mostly. Mistakes, errors, flawed hypotheses that continually piecemeal get amended and improved upon. Scientism is the idea that science as a discipline, as a body of knowledge, as knowledge itself, will be able to answer all the questions humanity has. That's the negative interpretation. So science and the scientific method is one thing. Scientism is, you want to know what the meaning of life is? You want to know what morality is? You want to know what beauty, truth, justice is? All of that can be answered with science. Probably that's the sense that they were using it. But they were using it for a particular purpose. They were trying to equate science with scientism. Science that says the earth is spherical, bullshit, that's scientism. And scientism is a problem, therefore earth is flat. That is a straw man fallacy, because scientists who argue the earth is spherical are not scientism, how would you put it? Scientismists? Good Lord, I have no idea. Are not engaging in scientism. They've got evidence, they've got arguments. They can say the earth is spherical without having to say, and also science can answer everything. Or more generally, because science can answer everything, and science says the earth is spherical, therefore the earth is spherical. That's not what a legitimate scientist with integrity is going to say. So, here's the quote from Ritchie. After he spent a significant amount of time showing scientists are human beings, therefore capable of all the biases that we've discussed so far in this class, and we'll see more, we need to be cautious of the, quote, nihilism of becoming suspicious of any and all new results, given our knowledge that the stream of scientific progress is far from pure. Nihilism is a kind of belief in nothing. It's a kind of extreme skepticism. If you want to go back to, there's different senses of nihilism. That's one of the terms, one of the senses. A healthy dose of skepticism, that's rational skepticism. That's finding that middle ground of revisability, conservatism, and so forth. A healthy dose of skepticism is good. Throwing the baby out with any polluted bathwater isn't. Science is one of humanity's proudest achievements. And simply because a lot of it is wrong, false, puffed, or misleading, it doesn't mean that it never correctly identified anything important. And I think that's where Mizrahi is. And I don't think Mizrahi ultimately disagrees with Nichols. Or rather, their disagreement might be on the technical matter, and here Mizrahi has expertise where Nichols does not. Nichols is an expert in political science. Mizrahi is an expert in logic, in epistemology. On page 71, he gives a number of the dilemmas, which I think is a good way of expanding upon his case. And he offers this caveat, does Mizrahi. Scientists themselves rarely, if ever, establish conclusions by appealing to expertise. That is important. Anyway, it escapes me. They're not, I don't think, ever saying, this is true because I, the expert, say it. They give reasons, and a good reporter will ask. They don't just say, here's an expert, go with them. They will ask, on what basis do you, with your expertise, expand upon this? Scientists themselves rarely, if ever, establish conclusions by appealing to expertise. Instead, scientists usually appeal to observations and experiments, among other things. And such scientists would be experts in being able to do such things. Not to expertise as such. It is non-experts rather than experts that rely on appeals to expertise. So I don't think that my arguments pose any threat to the scientific enterprise. So he's addressing one of the potential worries, one of the potential rebuttals. And it would be a significant rebuttal that if we accept Mizrahi's arguments, we would then need to undermine all of science. There we could easily come up with a reductio ad absurdum against Mizrahi, such that we'd say, if what you're saying is true, assume your claims. And if your claims are true, they lead to the undermining of all scientific knowledge. But to do so would be absurd. Therefore, it must be your initial claims are not true. But as Mizrahi points out, that's a straw man. I'm not actually saying that. And I think there's a good way of looking at a middle ground here, where it's not obvious that Mizrahi pushes this, and it's not obvious that Nichols pushes this. There's a great quote from Aristotle's Ethics, Nicomachean Ethics, quoting Hesiod. Quote, "The best man of all is he who knows everything himself. Good also the man who accepts another's sound advice. But the man who neither knows himself nor takes to heart what another says, well, he is no good at all." I mean, I don't like that, saying the person's not good. That's not how we should speak. But it's a kind of middle ground here where we say, look, and there's a great link, and I should have required it. It's not that long, but it really sums up the two positions, which are kind of extreme. They're foolish, extreme in this sense, as Michael Huemer is the philosopher who this link is to, on challenging the experts. There's on one side of the extreme, always ignore the experts. That's what Nichols is worried about. That's where he sees the death of expertise. Ooh, the elitist experts. Screw them. Not listening to anything they say. That well is poisoned. Michael Huemer points out that's foolish. But always believe the experts is also, he says, foolish. And here's the link to it. And it's a blog. I've just referenced the blog for you. Is that ever acceptable? Yes. Yes, it is. And it's named Fake News, which is confusing. Fake news. He's clever. Michael Huemer is a philosopher of Boulder. He's a well-established philosopher. And there's reasons why I quote him here. He's a good logician as well. Nous is clever. Nous is Greek for mind. So he's just playing off of fake news. And also, there's another webpage about philosophy called The Daily News, as opposed to news, that he's playing off of those titles. He explains that somewhere. But you can see who he is. So there's a reference to him. You can also click on the things he's written. You can see the posts he's cited. And most importantly, to his point, you can look at his arguments. You can look at the logic. You can look and see why it is he sees the two extremes as problematic. What's wrong with ignoring the experts? And then what's wrong with always believing the experts? It's actually not that long of a read. Again, I probably should have acquired it because it does such a good job clarifying those two positions and why a middle ground makes a lot of sense, such that there is a middle ground. Whether it's right in the middle, of course, that's debatable. So definitely take a look at that. That's, again, Michael Huemer, fake news website. All right, let's wrap up with a review. 2 criteria with respect to determining a credibility of someone's claims. If somebody says something to you and it is initially implausible, what does that mean? Well, it goes against your web of beliefs. It doesn't fit with what you already take to be the case. Now, that's not going to be enough to say it's false. That should be just a red flag. Figuring out what is plausible versus implausible, a wide breadth of knowledge is useful for that, which is a justification for a liberal arts education, by the way. Is college for everyone? Well, I think first 2 years of certainly. Initial plausibility is oftentimes going to be difficult to determine. There are 2 essential criteria when taking the testimony of others. Are they experts in the area in question? And are they trustworthy? And we talked about a bunch of that last time. If they're just an expert but not trustworthy, that's not good enough. If they're trustworthy but not an expert, well, that's potentially problematic. Although Mizrahi gives examples of counters. Also, we talked about the difference between authority and expertise, or rather the different senses of authority. I could be an authority figure in the sense that I'm in charge. That's not what we're interested in. We're interested in the epistemic authority, and that's why Mizrahi just focuses on expertise. That's clearer, I think, rather than authority. Although historically the word argument from authority, veracundium, has been used, the Latin term for that. But I think expertise makes more sense. What do we do if there is distinction, difference, disagreement in a particular field among experts? Well, it's not obvious. And one of the things you can do is try to figure out who's more qualified in a particular area. Figure out which one's with the majority of the experts in that particular issue. These individually aren't sufficient for you to make your decision. It's more of a cumulative case. If you find that this person's more qualified than their alternatives, who are making alternative claims. Not only are they more qualified, they're with the majority of experts. They're making initially plausible claims, whereas the counter-arguments are initially implausible. The individual is also not biased. They're not an interested party. And remember what an interested party is. That is somebody who stands to gain by you accepting their conclusion. And gain in a significant way. Everyone technically stands to gain by accepting their conclusion. Why else are they making a case for something? But are they gaining financially? Are they gaining power, wealth, or something like that by you accepting their conclusion? That's a relevant red flag. It's not enough to say that their arguments are no good because they're interested. They stand to gain. The lawyers for oil companies, that just polluted just south of here last month, they're going to argue all sorts of things in support of the oil companies to protect them. Their arguments no good just because they're interested and gain financially by them winning the arguments for their companies? No, but it's a red flag, and we don't rely only upon their position there. And then, of course, the next question, is there even an expert in the area of dispute? And what is the area of dispute? I didn't add that here. Is the area of dispute in the very malleable and complex and muddy world of human interactions, like sociology? That doesn't mean there aren't experts in sociology, but what qualifies as expertise, what qualifies as criteria or standards of justification and truth might be different in sociology than in, say, physics. And not because sociology is less cognitive or important or whatever as physics. They're just different knowledge domains. They're different kinds of subject matter. Sociology might be the most difficult subject matter because it is of humans and groups, not just individuals, but group interaction. Some advice. Work on honing, practicing, cultivating a rationally skeptical attitude. Not extreme skepticism, not dogmatism, but conservatism and revisability. And in doing so, you habituate yourself to read beyond the headline. You read a headline that you agree with, it sounds funny, your inclination is to immediately agree with it, don't read anymore, or maybe even share it to other people. Get into the habit of reading something that you agree with, to have that be your red flag. And say to yourself, why is it that I immediately agree with this claim? Is there something wrong with it? Might I find a flaw in it? So don't just read the headline. Look at the source. So I just showed you an example from Michael Humer's blog posts. Look at what else he has written. What kind of language does he use? What kind of other stories does he write about? Are they initially plausible or implausible? Are they purely ideological with a particular political bent where I'm a liberal and conservatives are evil, or vice versa? And that kind of language is found there. It's dramatic, it's inflammatory language, it's absolutist language. All of these people are this. They're the enemy of the people. That kind of language it should be a flag that tells you this is less credible than it could be. Is it just clickbait? Are they just saying things to get you to click on it to get more advertisement? And I know it takes time, but read more than one source of information, especially if it's a controversial issue. Oh, this seems almost obvious. But decision procedures that Mizrahi talks about, I should add that here. You might benefit yourself with having a list. It sounds absurd, but before I start looking on the internet for anything, write out a list of things that I should be looking for. and actually go through that list. Because when you get into the habit of searching for things on your phone, on your computer, you're typically not doing that. You're going with the first hits in Google. You're going with the stories that you agree with. And it's easy to do that because in many cases the algorithms, at least on your Facebook page, direct you to the more pleasing stories, the more stories that confirm what you already take to be the case. More on that as we go. And more on that as we learn from internal memos regarding Facebook's understanding of how things work. Finally, what's the purpose of the source? Are they just advertising? Are they fundraising? Are they trying to scare you into giving them money, as happened to me? I got an email saying, here's an election that's happening right now. We need your money to help, because you want these people to win, don't you? Because if they lose, then these guys get in charge, and look what happens. And that upset me, so I did not send them any money. Their interest is not in telling you something that is true and justifying their claims. Their interest is in getting money from you. Is it mere opinion? Is it satire? Is it news? Is it entertainment? Are the people venting or trolling? Or just general bullshitting? And you might ask, what's bullshit?
Do you ever read The Onion?
Oh, yes. So last week we talked about The Onion on Kim Jong-un being the sexiest man alive. So go back to the slides from that one. That's satire, and we were comparing it to fake news. Fake news is not the same thing as satire. And there was a contrast. And yes, The Onion, that looked like I said onion there. Satire is not news. Jon Stewart's show, The Daily Show, and John Oliver's, those were, actually John Oliver's is not the good example, but Jon Stewart calls his show fake news, and yet many people received information and good news or an understanding of what was going on in the world via his comedic interpretations. But he was in many cases, he was primarily interested in entertainment and in satire, but not all satire. In fact, satire, for it to work, has to be based in some element of truth. An argument could be made. But is it just bullshitting? You want to know what that is? Come to next class. You will find out. Because we will be dealing with bullshit. Mostly bullshit. And you can say the word, all class. We can just free for all. Throw out other words too. Not all words. Let's be cautious. Let me stop you right there. But bullshit will be allowed because we're going to be talking about it. Okay, questions?